The wind tore through the pines that clung to the side of the mountain, whistling against the logs of Elias Turner's cabin. Snow pressed heavy on the roof, and the fire he had built earlier crackled faintly, not enough to drive away the chill that seemed to seep into his bones. Elias was a man accustomed to silence. For years he had lived alone here at the edge of the Rockies, with only the howl of wolves and the occasional crow's call to remind him of life beyond the trees. He had chosen solitude long ago, after too many losses, too many roads that ended in betrayal. His hands were rough from years of trapping and cutting wood, his beard streaked with grey, and his eyes carried the stillness of a man who had seen much yet spoke little of it. That night, however, silence broke. It came first as a faint knock, timid against the door. Then another, sharper, almost desperate. Elias froze, his knife resting in his palm. No one came here without reason, not in the dead of winter, not so deep in the mountains. He unlatched the heavy wooden door, and the storm blew in with 3 figures pressed close together. Girls. The oldest, barely 16, her dark hair plastered with snow, her chin lifted in stubborn defiance. Beside her, a smaller one, maybe 12, wide-eyed and trembling. The third, no more than 7, clutched a ragged doll and stared at him with the hollow look of hunger. "We need shelter," the oldest said, her voice firm, though her lips quivered from the cold. "Just for tonight." Elias studied them for a long moment. Strangers meant trouble. Out here, trouble often meant death. Trouble. Yet something in their faces, fear mixed with courage, stirred something long dormant in him. Without a word, he stepped aside. The girls shuffled in, snow melting onto his wooden floor. The eldest introduced herself as Clara, the middle one Margaret, and the smallest Ruth. Elias gave them stew left simmering on the fire. They ate with the ferocity of the starving, Ruth clutching her bowl with both hands, Margaret whispering thanks between bites, Clara watching him as though expecting betrayal at any moment. Elias leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Where's your family?" he asked. Clara hesitated. "Gone," she said flatly. "It's just us now." The storm outside swelled, rattling the shutters. Elias said nothing more, though questions weighed heavy in his mind. He had no use for the affairs of others, but taking in 3 orphaned sisters was no small matter. The mountains could be merciless. Even he struggled some winters to keep himself alive. Still, something about them pulled at him. Maybe it was the way Clara shielded her sisters with every glance, or how Margaret clung to a scrap of hope in her soft voice, or Ruth's innocent trust as she leaned against the warmth of the fire. Elias had lived too long without company, and their presence unsettled him in ways he could not yet name. That night he lay on his bedroll listening to the girls' breathing. For years the cabin had echoed with nothing but the creak of wood and the sigh of wind. Now there were whispers, soft laughter, the shifting of small bodies under blankets. Elias stared at the ceiling and felt a weight lift from the silence. He didn't know then what bringing them inside would mean. He didn't know the dangers that trailed their steps, or the choices that would soon test every value he held dear. But as the storm raged outside and dawn inched closer, one truth settled deep in him. The lives of these 3 sisters had already become tangled with his own. And before this story reaches its end, you will want to know every twist and turn that binds them together. Subscribe now, so you don't miss a moment of this journey through the unforgiving heart of the frontier. Morning broke with a pale light seeping through the frosted cracks of the cabin's shutters. The storm had quieted, leaving behind a silence so thick that even the forest seemed reluctant to stir. Elias rose early, as was his habit, stirring the ashes of the fire and adding kindling until the flames licked back to life. He glanced at the corner where the 3 sisters lay bundled beneath quilts. Their breathing was soft, their bodies curled together for warmth, like a small flock of birds seeking shelter. Clara was the first to wake. She sat up slowly, eyes sharp, scanning the cabin as though reminding herself where she was. When she noticed Elias at the hearth, her expression hardened, the look of someone determined not to show weakness. "You don't have to feed us again," she said, her voice firm though still hoarse from the night before. "We'll be gone soon." Elias didn't answer at once. He lifted the kettle, poured hot water into a tin cup and slid it toward her. "Drink," he muttered. "Storm left no trail worth walking. You'd freeze before midday." Margaret stirred next, rubbing her eyes, her face soft with gratitude that she did not dare put into words. Ruth followed, clutching her ragged doll as though it were a lifeline. Elias handed them each a piece of bread, hard from storage but enough to quiet their hunger. The girls ate in silence until Ruth, her small voice carrying through the cabin, asked, "Are you always alone here?" Elias met her gaze, surprised by the innocence in it. "A man's got all he needs in these mountains," he replied, though the words felt heavier than usual. Margaret leaned forward, curiosity brightening her face. "But don't you ever get tired of only hearing your own voice?" Clara shot her a warning glance, but Elias chuckled, the sound rough and unused. "There's plenty of voices in the wind, sometimes more than a man can handle." The small exchange eased the room, but only slightly. Clara remained guarded, her shoulders tense, her eyes never resting long on Elias. He recognized the weight she carried, responsibility pressed too early upon young shoulders. She reminded him of himself, long ago, before the mountains swallowed him whole. Later that day, Elias set about checking the traps he'd laid before the storm. Margaret, curious and restless, asked to go with him. Clara objected instantly. "She's not wandering off into the snow with a stranger." Elias kept his voice even. "She'll be safe. Better she learn something useful than sit staring at the walls." Margaret looked at her sister pleadingly, and after a long silence, Clara gave a reluctant nod. Out in the crisp air, Margaret struggled to keep pace, her breath puffing like smoke. Elias showed her how to read tracks pressed into the snow, how to spot where a rabbit might have darted beneath the brush. She listened intently, eager, her eyes shining with the kind of wonder he hadn't seen in years. When they returned with 2 rabbits, Clara tried to mask her surprise. "She should be resting, not trudging through drifts." "She's stronger than you think," Elias said, hanging the rabbits by the door. "Strength grows when it's tested." Clara bristled but said nothing more. That evening, Elias showed Margaret how to skin the rabbit, guiding her hands as she grimaced and then steadied herself. Ruth clapped softly, proud of her sister, while Clara turned her face away, though her eyes lingered. By nightfall, the cabin carried a warmth Elias had not felt in years. The stew pot simmered, the girls' quiet chatter filling the space that once echoed only with silence. For the first time in a long while, Elias didn't feel the weight of emptiness pressing in. Yet beneath the fragile peace, he knew this was only the beginning. The mountains tested all who dared stay within them, and strangers carried stories not easily left behind. The snow outside had hardened into a crust by the 3rd morning, glittering in the pale sun that crept between the peaks. Elias sat by the fire, sharpening his knife, each stroke against the whetstone steady and precise, the kind of rhythm that kept his thoughts from running too far. But that morning the thoughts would not be stilled. The presence of the 3 sisters had disturbed the quiet order of his days, and in their faces he saw memories he had long buried. When Clara moved about the cabin, her chin lifted in defiance, he saw a reflection of his wife's stubborn courage, a woman who had not survived the border raid that had stolen the rest of his family. The sound of Margaret's laughter, tentative yet growing stronger each day, reminded him of his little boy whose echo had haunted these walls for years. And Ruth, curling up against the fire with her ragged doll, stirred in him a tenderness he had sworn he'd lost forever. Clara noticed the way his eyes lingered on them. One evening, when Margaret and Ruth were drowsing by the fire, she confronted him. "You act like you know us," she said bluntly, arms folded tight across her chest. "But we don't know you. Why do you care what happens to us?" Elias looked at her, his face carved in shadow by the firelight. "A man doesn't have to know someone to see they're in need," he answered quietly. Clara's eyes narrowed. "Need can get you killed out here. Trust can too." Her words struck with a truth he couldn't deny. He respected her suspicion, even admired it, but it built a wall between them. Elias let the silence sit, unwilling to explain the ache in his chest that even he didn't fully understand. That night, long after the girls had fallen asleep, Elias lay awake, listening to the wind pressing against the cabin walls. Memories rose unbidden, flames devouring the small home he had once built with his wife, the sound of gunfire, the cries of children silenced too soon. He had walked into these mountains not to find life, but to escape it. Now, with 3 young faces looking to him for safety, the past stirred like a restless animal, refusing to stay buried. The next day, while Elias chopped wood, Ruth toddled out into the yard, her small boots crunching in the snow. She sat on a stump and hummed a song he didn't recognize, her voice soft and sweet. Elias paused, axe in hand, and for a moment he felt warmth spread through the cold air. He almost smiled. Then Clara appeared, pulling Ruth back toward the door. "Stay close," she scolded her sister, casting Elias a look heavy with mistrust. "Don't go wandering." Elias said nothing, but the sting of her suspicion lodged deeper than he liked to admit. That evening Margaret asked him about the knife he carried. "Is it only for hunting?" she asked, curiosity shining in her eyes. Elias studied her before answering. "A man carries a knife for many reasons. Some he hopes never to use." Margaret tilted her head. "Were you in a war?" He didn't answer, only stared into the flames. The silence was enough of a reply, and Clara quickly pulled her sister close, ending the conversation. But the question lingered in the air, along with the unspoken sense that Elias carried more than just solitude on his shoulders. Later that night, while tending to his traps outside, Elias spotted faint marks in the snow, disturbed patches leading toward the trees. Not animal tracks. Boot prints. He crouched low, heart tightening, studying the path until it vanished into the woods. When he returned to the cabin, his knife hung heavy at his belt, and his gaze shifted often to the shuttered windows. He said nothing to the girls, but a thought weighed hard in his mind. Someone else was out there watching. And the peace he had tried to build inside those wooden walls was already cracking under the shadow of things. Neither he nor the sisters had yet spoken aloud. The snow had loosened its grip when Elias finally decided to take the girls down to the trading post. Supplies were running low, and though he disliked venturing into town, he knew 4 mouths couldn't be fed on the rabbits and venison alone. The trail wound down through pine and aspen, their branches heavy with white, the sky overhead pale as steel. The sisters walked close together, Clara's hand gripping Ruth's tightly, Margaret stepping lively as if curious about everything around her. By the time they reached the cluster of buildings that made up the settlement, smoke curled from chimneys, and the smell of horses drifted thick in the air. Men in worn coats leaned against posts, women hurried with baskets, and children darted between wagons. Elias felt the eyes fall on him almost at once. He was used to it. Mountain men rarely drew anything but suspicion. But today the stares lingered longer, sharpening when they caught sight of the 3 girls trailing him. At the general store, the bell above the door gave a thin jangle. Mr. Barlow, the storekeeper, looked up from behind the counter, his round face settling into a cautious smile. "Turner," he said slowly. "Didn't expect to see you before spring thaw." His gaze slid past Elias to Clara, Margaret, and Ruth. "And who do we have here?" "My responsibility for now," Elias replied, voice low but steady. Barlow's eyebrows rose, though he said nothing more, as Elias set flour, beans, and salt on the counter. Still, the silence carried judgment heavy enough to fill the room. Margaret leaned close to Ruth, whispering to calm her sister's wide eyes, while Clara stood stiff as a fence post, glaring at anyone who dared linger too long on them. When Elias stepped outside, the sheriff was waiting. Sheriff Donnelly was a tall man, his coat dusted with snow, his badge glinting in the weak light. "Turner," he greeted, his tone cordial but edged. "Haven't seen you in town for months. Word is you've taken on company." Elias adjusted the sack on his shoulder. "Found them near my place during the storm. Couldn't leave them out there." Donnelly's eyes narrowed slightly. "You planning on keeping them?" "They'll stay till they've got somewhere safe to go," Elias said, the firmness in his voice leaving little room for debate. The sheriff studied him a long moment, then tipped his hat. "Be careful, Turner. Folks get to talking, and you know how talk can turn to trouble." On the walk back up the trail, Clara broke the silence. "He doesn't trust you," she said. "Don't need his trust," Elias answered. "But he might make you need it," she pressed, her eyes sharp. You're risking more than yourself keeping us. Elias looked at her, reading the fear behind her defiance. A man risks something every day he draws breath out here, he said. That's the way of it. Margaret spoke softly, trying to bridge the tension. I liked the store, it smelled like coffee. Ruth nodded, clutching her doll tighter. And sugar, she added with a shy smile. Their small voices lightened the moment, but Clara kept her gaze fixed ahead, her jaw set. Elias felt the weight of her mistrust pressing against him, and he knew the sheriff's warning had only scratched the surface of what lay ahead. By the time they reached the cabin again, the sun was sliding low, spilling copper light over the snow. Elias unloaded the supplies, his mind churning. He had survived years in the mountains by keeping to himself, by avoiding entanglements. Now, with the community whispering and the sheriff's eyes on him, those rules no longer held. And in the uneasy quiet of that evening, he realized the girl's presence was not only a matter of survival against the cold. It was a test of whether solitude had made him stronger or whether it had left him unprepared for the weight of others' lives. The cabin glowed with firelight, shadows flickering along the walls while the wind pressed against the shutters. Elias sat at the table, carving a strip of wood into something shapeless, his knife moving in slow, deliberate strokes. The girls were quiet that evening, each of them carrying a restlessness that no warmth could ease. Clara's gaze lingered on the flames, her lips pressed tight, as though words sat heavy on her tongue, but refused to break free. At last, she spoke. You keep looking at us like you want answers, she said, her tone sharper than intended. So I'll give you some. Elias paused mid-stroke, the knife hovering over the wood. I don't need answers, he muttered. Yes, you do, Clara shot back, because the longer we stay here, the more danger you're in. You should know what kind of trouble you've taken in. Margaret looked uneasy, her fingers clutching the hem of her skirt. Clara. No, Clara interrupted, her voice firm. He deserves to hear it. The air in the cabin tightened. Ruth curled closer to her sister, her small hand gripping Clara's arm. Elias set the knife down, his eyes steady. Go on. Clara took a long breath, her voice carrying both bitterness and pain. Our father, Daniel Hale, he wasn't the man people think he was. Folks in town said he was a thief, said he stole from the ranchers. But I know better. He didn't steal, he just made enemies, dangerous ones. Margaret's voice trembled. He was good, Elias. He cared for us. He promised we'd be safe. Clara's jaw tightened. Safe? He left us when the men came looking. Told us to run, told us he'd meet us later, but he never showed. So we ran and we kept running, until the storm brought us to your door. Elias listened in silence, his mind turning over their words. He had known men like Daniel Hale, men who fought powerful enemies, sometimes noble, sometimes reckless, often crushed between. The truth was rarely clean. Margaret leaned forward, her eyes pleading. He wasn't guilty. I swear it. Those men, they wanted to ruin him. He found something out, something they didn't want known. Clara's voice cut sharp. You don't know that. All I know is he's gone, and we're the ones paying for it. The fire popped, sparks leaping up the chimney. Elias's hand tightened on the table's edge. He saw the fracture between the sisters, Clara hardened by fear, Margaret clinging to hope, Ruth too young to understand the weight pressing on them. Ruth's small voice broke the tension. Papa will come back. Clara flinched as though struck, and tears shimmered in her eyes, though she blinked them away quickly. Don't fill her head with lies, she snapped, more harshly than intended. Ruth looked down, clutching her doll tight, hurt flashing across her face. Elias's voice rumbled low. Hope ain't a lie. Sometimes it's all that keeps a soul moving. Clara turned to him, her eyes fierce. And what happens when hope gets you killed? The question hung heavy, pulling Elias back to his own memories, faces lost, promises broken, the fragile hope that had carried him into these mountains, and then betrayed him. He understood her anger, but he also understood Margaret's desperate need to believe. Both were truths he had lived. For a long while, none of them spoke. The fire dimmed, Shadows lengthened, and outside the wind moaned through the pines. At last Elias said quietly, "Whatever your father was or wasn't, you're here now. And while you're under my roof, no one lays a hand on you. That's what I can promise." Clara studied him, her eyes wary yet touched by something she wouldn't name. Margaret's shoulders eased, and even Ruth smiled faintly. Still, the air remained thick with questions unanswered, dangers unnamed. Elias knew then that taking them in had bound him to a story larger than the walls of his cabin, and the truth of it would not rest quietly for long. Snow came heavy again, thick flakes falling for days without pause, until the cabin seemed buried in white. The trail to town vanished beneath drifts, the trees bent low under the weight, and silence ruled the valley except for the groan of the wind. Elias knew these mountains well enough to understand what it meant. They were trapped until the thaw, and survival would depend on what little he had put away before the storm. The girls felt it too. Clara paced the cabin restless, her sharp eyes measuring the dwindling sacks of beans and flour. Margaret busied herself with chores, sweeping the same stretch of floor twice over, just to keep her hands from shaking. Ruth clung to her doll and asked when the sun would come back. Elias had no answer she could understand. One evening, while rationing out supper, Clara finally said what had been burning on her tongue. "There isn't enough for all of us, is there?" Elias stirred the pot of thin rabbit stew, his face unreadable. "Enough if we stretch it." "That's not the same thing as enough," she pressed. Margaret's voice trembled. "We can help, we can trap or gather wood or—" Elias cut her off gently. "The snow's too deep. A man could vanish out there in a blink." Clara slammed her spoon down, the clatter sharp in the quiet. "You'd risk yourself for us, but not let us try. You can't do everything alone." Her words struck harder than she knew. Elias stared into the pot, his silence thick. He remembered winters past when he had done everything alone, hunting, chopping, rationing, and the weight of it had nearly crushed him. Now the burden was heavier still, and yet, strangely, he did not want to carry it alone. The next day, he showed Clara how to split logs. At first she struggled, the axe slipping, her breath clouding in frustration. "It's too heavy," she snapped. "Then hold it steady," Elias said calmly. "Strength comes after steadiness." She glared at him but tried again. This time the axe bit into the wood, not cleanly, but enough to split it with effort. Her eyes widened, pride flickering behind her stubborn mask. Margaret clapped softly and Ruth squealed with delight. Clara hid her smile, but Elias caught it. Later Margaret asked for a story, her eyes bright despite the cold seeping through the walls. Elias hesitated. He had not spoken of the past in years, but as the fire cracked, he told them of mountain trails that wound higher than clouds, of rivers that roared so loud they silenced every thought, of elk so large they seemed carved from the earth itself. Margaret listened in awe, her questions spilling one after another. Clara pretended not to care, but her gaze lingered, drawn in despite herself. Ruth fell asleep against Elias's arm, her tiny breaths warm on his sleeve. That night, when the wind howled hardest, Elias thought about sending them away once the storm eased. His cabin had never been meant for more than one. Supplies could not last forever, and their presence drew dangers he could not yet name. The safe choice was to let them go, to return to silence and solitude. But then he looked at the three of them huddled together, their faces softened by firelight, and something inside him shifted. He had lived so long keeping only himself alive. Now, for the first time in years, he wondered if survival meant more than just enduring the winter. The snow outside showed no sign of letting up. The storm pressed harder against the walls, and hunger grew sharper each day. Elias knew the mountains tested every soul who tried to endure them, and this winter he was not facing them alone. The storm eased after long weeks, leaving the valley cloaked in a brittle stillness. Snow glittered under the pale moon, untouched and perfect, yet Elias knew perfection in the mountains never lasted. One night, while checking the traps a short distance from the cabin, he stopped dead. Among the prints of rabbits and foxes, another mark pressed into the snow. Boot tracks. Not his, not the girls. Someone had been close, watching. He crouched, studying the impressions, The stride was heavy, the heel worn on the left. Whoever it was had lingered, the tracks circling near before fading into the trees. Elias's gut tightened. The mountains were no place for casual visitors, not in this weather. Whoever came here had a reason. When he returned, he hung his rifle by the door but didn't remove his coat. Clara noticed his tension at once. "What did you see?" she asked, her voice sharp. Elias glanced at the girls huddled near the fire before answering. "Tracks. Not animal. Someone's been near." Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Ruth clutched her doll, eyes wide. Clara's jaw tightened. "They're looking for us," she said flatly, as if confirming what she had feared all along. Elias moved to the window, peering into the dark. "Could be anyone. Trapper. Drifter." "No," Clara snapped. "It's because of our father. It always is." The weight in her voice silenced the room. Elias turned back, his face shadowed in the firelight. "Doesn't matter who they are. While you're here, no one gets through that door uninvited." The next day, Elias set to work reinforcing the cabin. He checked the shutters, stacked wood against the back wall, and laid his knife sharpener across the table. Clara watched him from the corner, arms folded. At last she asked the question she had been holding back. "Are we worth this trouble to you?" Elias didn't stop his work. "It ain't a matter of worth." "Then what is it?" she pressed, her voice cracking. "You barely know us, yet you're sharpening blades and acting like you'll fight whoever's out there. Why?" He set the knife down, finally meeting her eyes. "Because leaving 3 girls to fend for themselves in these mountains would make me less of a man than I can stomach." Clara swallowed hard, but said nothing, her eyes glistening with a mix of defiance and something softer she refused to show. That night, the cabin seemed to shrink under the weight of unspoken fear. Every creak of wood, every howl of the wind outside sounded like footsteps. Ruth whimpered in her sleep, clinging tighter to her doll. Margaret whispered prayers, her lips moving silently as she lay under the quilts. Clara sat awake long after the others had drifted off, her eyes fixed on the knife Elias had left within reach. Elias dozed lightly by the fire, his rifle close at hand. His mind replayed the sight of those boot tracks, the certainty that whoever had left them would return. He had lived long enough to know men with heavy strides did not wander aimlessly in winter. They hunted, and they would not stop until they found what they were after. The fire burned low, shadows stretching across the walls like long fingers. Elias kept his ears sharp, his body tense, every breath measured. Somewhere in the trees beyond the cabin he felt it, a presence, watching, waiting. The mountains had taught him many lessons: how to survive hunger, how to fight cold, how to outlast storms. But this was different. This was danger with a face unseen, a silence heavier than the snow outside. And as the night deepened, Elias knew the test ahead would demand more than endurance. It would demand choices that could not be undone. Dawn broke cold and brittle, the kind of morning where frost clung stubbornly to every branch. Elias stepped outside to fetch water from the stream when he spotted movement along the trail. A lone rider approached slowly, his horse laboring in the snow. The figure sat tall in the saddle, wrapped in a dark coat, his hat pulled low. Something in the measured pace, deliberate and unhurried, set Elias on edge. He went back inside, his voice steady but urgent. "Stay quiet. Someone's coming." Clara's eyes sharpened instantly. "Who?" "Don't know," Elias said, reaching for his rifle. "But don't let him see you." "Not yet." The sisters huddled near the far wall while Elias stepped out again, leaning casually against the porch beam, though his muscles were taut. The rider halted a few yards away, tipping his hat in greeting. "Morning," the man said, his voice smooth as creek water. "Didn't expect to find a cabin this far up." Elias nodded once. "Not much worth finding." The man smiled faintly, though it didn't touch his eyes. "Could use some water for my horse. Maybe a bite to eat. Long ride." Elias studied him. The horse's flanks were lathered with sweat, its sides heaving. Whoever this man was, he'd been pushing hard. Elias gestured toward the trough he kept by the side. "Water's there." "Food you'll have to find elsewhere." The rider dismounted slowly, stretching his back. His gaze drifted toward the cabin, lingering too long on the shuttered window where Ruth had peeked before Clara yanked her back. "Looks like you've got company," the man said, his tone casual but the words heavy with meaning. Elias's hand rested lightly on the rifle. "Company comes and goes." "Ain't your concern." The stranger chuckled, though his eyes stayed sharp. "Fair enough, name's Harlan. Been tracking through these hills a while. Thought I knew every soul up here." "Then you thought wrong," Elias replied. For a moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by the sound of the horse drinking. Harlan leaned against the saddle, his gaze fixed on Elias. "Funny thing," he drawled. "Heard tell of 3 girls running wild after their pa got himself into a mess. Folks say they might have headed north. Dangerous for children to be out in this cold, don't you think?" Elias's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed level. "Children don't last long up here. If they came this way, the mountains already claimed them." Harlan tilted his head, studying Elias with the ease of a man used to prying secrets from silence. Then he pushed himself upright, brushing snow from his coat. "Maybe so, maybe not. Still, if you happen across anyone who don't belong, you'd best let the right people know. Strangers can bring nothing but trouble." Elias gave a single nod, his eyes never leaving Harlan's. "I'll keep that in mind." With a final glance toward the cabin, Harlan swung into the saddle. "Much obliged for the water. Hope the mountains treat you kindly." He rode off, the sound of hooves muffled by snow, but Elias didn't relax until the figure vanished into the trees. Even then, the unease lingered like smoke after fire. Inside, Clara was waiting, her face pale but resolute. "He knew," she whispered. "He knew about us." Margaret's hands trembled as she clasped Ruth close. "What if he comes back?" Elias set the rifle against the wall, his voice low. "Then we'll be ready." But even as he spoke, he felt the truth press heavy in his chest. Harlan hadn't ridden into the mountains by chance. He had been searching, and now he had a scent to follow. The mountains were wide, the storms merciless, but danger had found its way to his door. The cabin felt smaller after Harlan's visit, the air thicker, as though his presence had left a shadow clinging to the walls. Elias sat at the table, running his thumb along the edge of his rifle, silent while the fire popped and hissed. The sisters huddled together, their unease plain in every movement. Clara's sharp gaze followed him like a hawk, as if measuring whether he could truly be trusted. At last she broke the silence. "You could have told him." Elias lifted his eyes slowly. "Told him what?" "That we're here," Clara said, her chin lifting. "One word from you and we'd have been his problem, not yours." Margaret's voice trembled. "Clara, don't—" "No," Clara pressed, her tone edged with steel. "We don't know him, Margaret. We don't know what he owes, what he's running from. He could have given us away and been done with us." Elias studied her, the weight of her suspicion cutting deeper than he cared to admit. "If I meant to hand you over, I'd have done it already," he said simply. Clara folded her arms, refusing to look away. "Then why didn't you? What do you get from keeping us?" His jaw worked, but he didn't answer right away. The truth tangled inside him. He could walk away. Let the girls be taken. Let the storm of their troubles pass over him. That was the safe path, the path solitude had always demanded. Yet when he looked at their faces, weary but unbroken, he found the thought unbearable. Later, while the sisters slept, Elias sat awake by the fire, the crackle of flames loud against the silence. He turned over the question in his mind again and again. Why was he risking himself for them? Why not cut the rope before it dragged him down with their troubles? His gaze fell to a small locket on the shelf, tarnished and forgotten until Margaret had stumbled upon it days earlier. She had held it in her hands with reverence, tracing the faded engraving. "It's beautiful," she'd whispered, eyes wide. Elias had nearly taken it back at once, but something stopped him. For the first time in years, he'd spoken of his wife, how she had given him the locket, how she had laughed brighter than summer fields. Margaret had listened quietly, her face soft with understanding. "She must have loved you," she'd said. The memory returned now, heavy but strangely steadying. He could not give Margaret's hope, Clara's fire or Ruth's innocence to men like Harlan, not when he still carried the ghost of love in his chest. The next morning, Clara confronted him again. "If danger comes back, you don't owe us anything. You can walk away." Elias met her eyes, voice low and certain. "I won't." Her brows knit, suspicion warring with disbelief. "Why not?" "Because I've already walked away once in my life," he said, his voice rough with memory. "And it cost me more than I can ever get back. I won't do it again." Clara faltered, her lips parting as though to argue, but the words never came. She turned away quickly, blinking hard, unwilling to let him see the crack in her armor. Ruth tugged at Elias's sleeve then, her small voice breaking the tension. "You won't let them take us?" Elias rested a hand gently on her shoulder. "Not while I draw breath." The cabin grew quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet, less brittle, more weighted with fragile trust. Still, Elias knew the silence outside would not hold. Men like Harlan didn't ask questions for curiosity's sake. They circled, they probed, and when the time was right, they struck. And when that day came, Elias would need more than promises. He would need resolve sharper than any blade. The first light of dawn spilled across the mountains, staining the snow in soft hues of rose and gold. Elias was outside splitting wood, his breath clouding in the chill, when he heard the distant crunch of hooves. He froze, axe mid-swing, listening. The sound grew clearer, slow, deliberate steps of a horse climbing the trail. Elias's gut tightened. Harlan had returned, he thought. He gripped the axe handle, every sense alert. But when the rider emerged from the trees, Elias saw not Harlan's slick posture, but a man slumped forward in the saddle, his coat torn, his beard ragged with frost. His eyes burned with weary fire, and even from a distance Elias recognized the resemblance etched into his face, the sharp line of Clara's jaw, the softness of Margaret's eyes. The rider pulled the horse to a halt, swaying slightly before steadying himself. His voice was hoarse but carried weight. "My girls, are they here?" Elias felt the air still around him. Slowly, he lowered the axe. "Inside!" The man slid off the saddle, his legs trembling. He caught the stirrup to keep himself upright, then staggered toward the cabin. Elias followed, his rifle hand itching, suspicion coiling tight. When the door opened, the sisters looked up. Ruth's doll tumbled from her lap as her eyes widened. Margaret gasped, covering her mouth with both hands. Clara froze, her face pale, disbelief warring with fury. "Papa," Ruth whispered, her voice trembling. Daniel Hale dropped to his knees before them, his arms opening wide. Ruth darted forward, burying herself against him. Margaret followed, sobbing into his shoulder. Clara remained still, her fists clenched at her sides. Daniel's voice cracked. "My sweet girls, and I thought I'd lost you." Clara's voice cut sharp as a blade. "You did lose us, you left us." Daniel flinched as though struck. He reached a hand toward her, but she did not move. "Clara, I never meant—" "You told us to run," she snapped, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "And you didn't come, you left us to freeze, to starve, to beg strangers for shelter. Do you know what it's been like?" Elias stood back, silent, his eyes narrowing on the man. He saw the guilt in Daniel's face, the desperation in his movements. Yet guilt and desperation did not answer the question clawing at Elias. Why had this man abandoned them? Daniel bowed his head, his voice low. "I did it to keep you alive. Men were after me, men who would have cut you down without mercy if you stayed. I had to draw them away. I swore I'd come back when I could." Clara's voice broke with bitter laughter. "And now you just appear, after all this time, expecting us to forgive?" Margaret pulled at her sister's arm. "He's here now, Clara, that's all that matters." "No," Clara said fiercely, her eyes blazing. "It's not all that matters. We deserve the truth." Daniel looked at Elias then, as if measuring whether this mountain man was ally or enemy. "You've kept them alive," he said quietly. "For that, I owe you more than I can repay. But you should know, my return brings more than relief, it brings danger." Elias folded his arms. "Already figured that." "You best start explaining." Daniel drew a ragged breath, his shoulders sagging beneath the weight of untold words. "I didn't abandon them out of fear. I abandoned them because of what I carry. And now the storm I tried to keep from them has followed me here. Clara's eyes burned with questions. Margaret clung tighter to her father, and Ruth simply whispered, "Don't leave again." Elias felt the air shift, heavy with truths yet to be spoken. Whatever secret Daniel bore, it was no longer his alone to carry. It had entered the cabin with him, and it would not leave without consequence. The fire burned low, throwing long shadows across the cabin walls. Daniel sat hunched forward, his hands trembling though the room was warm. His daughters clung close, Ruth nestled against his side, Margaret clasping his arm as if afraid he might vanish again. Clara stood apart, arms crossed, her eyes sharp and unyielding. Elias leaned against the table, silent, waiting. At last, Daniel spoke. "You've heard the stories, that I was a thief, that I stole from men who had power enough to brand me outlaw." His voice cracked, but he pushed on. "It's all lies. They made me into something I wasn't, because I uncovered what they'd done." Margaret lifted her head quickly. "I told you, Clara, I told you he wasn't guilty." But Clara's voice cut cold. "Then explain it, Father. Explain what was so important you left us to run for our lives." Daniel's eyes filled with regret. "Land," he said simply. "Land stolen from families too poor to fight back. Ranchers with money and influence cut false deeds, seized acres that weren't theirs, and drove good people out. I was hired to keep their books, but I saw the truth in the papers. Whole valleys taken with ink and signatures forged in back rooms." Elias's eyes narrowed. "Land fraud. Seen it before. Greed runs deeper than rivers out here." Daniel nodded. "I gathered proof, deeds, names, ledgers that show everything. Enough to ruin them if it ever reached the courts, but they found out. That's when the fire started. The threats, the lies whispered in saloons until everyone believed I was the one stealing. They wanted me silenced before I could speak." Clara's fists clenched at her sides. "And so you left us. You chose your papers over your daughters." Daniel's voice broke. "I chose to draw them away from you. If I'd stayed, they'd have killed us all. Leaving you was the hardest thing I've ever done. Every mile I rode, I heard your voices behind me. But if I hadn't run, you wouldn't be here now." Ruth tugged at his sleeve, her small voice pleading. "Papa, no more leaving. Please." Daniel kissed the top of her head, his tears slipping into her hair. "No more if I can help it, little one. No more." Elias shifted, his expression unreadable. "You've still got the proof?" Daniel reached into his coat, pulling free a worn leather satchel. He placed it on the table with reverence, as if it carried not just papers but lives. "Everything's here. Deeds with false seals, ledgers with names. Enough to hang the ranchers who've been bleeding this land dry. But until it's in the right hands, it's a death sentence for anyone near me." Clara's voice dripped with bitterness. "So that's what we are. Pawns in your fight. The reason men like Harlan hunt us is because of what you carry." Margaret shook her head fiercely. "Clara, don't. He did it for us, for everyone. If he can stop them, it means families won't lose their homes." Elias spoke low, his tone steady as iron. "Both of you speak truth. Your father's fight may be just, but justice don't fill bellies or keep children warm. Men with power don't fall easy, and they won't stop chasing what he holds." Daniel looked at Elias then as if pleading for judgment. "You've kept them safe when I could not. You've seen what danger follows, but I can't run forever. I have to see this through even if it costs me." Clara's eyes glistened, torn between fury and longing. Margaret clung tighter, whispering, "We'll stand with you." Ruth, too young to grasp the depth of it, simply held her father's hand with quiet faith. Elias felt the weight settle like stone in his chest. Whatever choice came next, there would be no turning back. The secret was no longer hidden in one man's satchel. It now bound them all to its peril. The cabin grew quiet after Daniel's confession, though the weight of his words lingered like smoke. Elias sat near the fire, staring into the flames, while Daniel dozed fitfully against the wall, exhaustion etched deep in his face. The sisters hovered close to him, each revealing their hearts in their own way. Margaret's devotion shining, Ruth's innocence clinging, Clara's distrust simmering like an ember that refused to die. Elias felt the pull of a decision pressing on him harder with every breath. He had taken the girls in thinking it temporary, an act of necessity. But now their father had returned, dragging with him a storm of enemies and secrets. If Elias stood with them, he would be standing against men with wealth, guns, and reach that stretched beyond these mountains. If he stepped aside, he could retreat into solitude once more, leaving behind the burden of lives that were never his to carry. Clara seemed to sense his turmoil. She sat across from him, her eyes sharp as knives. "You're thinking of letting us go, aren't you?" Elias didn't answer at first. His jaw tightened, the firelight catching the grey in his beard. "A man's got to know the fight he can win. Yours may be bigger than what these mountains can hold." Her voice rose, trembling with both anger and fear. "So you'll turn your back, like everyone else? After everything you said, after promising we'd be safe?" Margaret reached for Clara's hand. "He hasn't turned his back," she pleaded softly. "He saved us. He fed us. He taught us. He's not like the others." Clara pulled away, her voice raw. "Then let him say it. Let him say he'll stand with us and not run." Elias looked at her, seeing not just the defiant girl before him, but the child who had carried too much weight too soon. Her words cut deep because they mirrored his own past. The promises broken, the trust shattered when men he relied upon had turned away. He had sworn never to carry that pain again. Yet here it was, pressing on him through her eyes. Ruth broke the tension, climbing into Elias's lap without asking. Her small voice carried more power than Clara's fire. "Don't leave us," she whispered. Elias's arms tightened around her instinctively. He could smell the faint smoke in her hair, feel the fragile beat of her heart against his chest. A warmth surged in him, fierce and undeniable. He set Ruth down gently, then turned to Clara. "I ain't a man who makes promises easy," he said, his voice low but steady. "But I'll tell you this, if danger comes, I won't run. Not from you, not from them." Clara's eyes flickered, suspicion warring with the first glimmer of belief. "And what about our father? You don't trust him?" Elias's gaze shifted to Daniel, sleeping uneasily, his satchel clutched close. "Trust is earned. But whether I trust him or not, I trust the three of you. That's enough for me." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, relief shining in them. Ruth smiled sleepily, content with his answer. But Clara's jaw remained tight, her heart unwilling to surrender so quickly. Still, her silence carried less venom than before. As the fire dimmed, Elias sat awake long after the others had fallen into uneasy sleep. He knew the choice he had made was no small vow. By standing with them, he was stepping into a war that might cost him everything. But for the first time in years, he felt something stronger than fear of loss, purpose. The night stretched on, heavy with waiting. Somewhere beyond the pines danger gathered, sharpening its edge. Elias's resolve had been spoken aloud, and he knew there would soon come a day when he would be tested. The air in the valley shifted days later, carrying with it the kind of silence Elias had learned to fear. The animals in the woods grew restless, the crows circled low, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Elias felt it in his bones before he saw it. Danger was close. He rose before dawn, stepping outside with his rifle slung across his back. The snow crunched underfoot as he scanned the tree line. That's when he spotted them, dark shapes moving low, deliberate, no more than shadows against the pale snow. Men, at least 3, maybe more, advancing with patience, born of experience. Harlan had returned, and this time he wasn't alone. Elias went back inside, his face grim. Daniel was already awake, as though he too had sensed what was coming. Their eyes met in wordless understanding. "How many?" Daniel asked quietly. "Enough," Elias replied. "They'll be here before noon." Clara sat up sharply, her fear quickly masked by anger. "We can't fight them." "Not all of them." Elias's voice stayed steady. "We won't fight them head-on. We'll use the mountain." The hours that followed were tense, filled with hurried preparation. Elias led Daniel outside, showing him narrow ridges where men could be funneled, gullies where snow packed heavy and unstable. He knew every twist of these woods, every hidden bend, and he meant to use them all. Back in the cabin, he handed Clara a knife. Her eyes widened, but she took it, her grip firm. "Stay close to your sisters. If anyone makes it through, you don't hesitate." Clara nodded, her jaw tight. "I won't." Margaret tried to sound brave. "We can help, Elias. Tell us what to do. Keep Ruth quiet. Keep yourselves low. That's all I ask." By late morning, the first man stepped into view, a rifle slung casually in his hands. Harlan followed behind, his smile as cold as the snow beneath his boots. "Turner," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the clearing. "I told you strangers bring trouble. Best hand them over now and we can all walk away." Elias stood in plain sight, his rifle resting easy but ready. "Not happening." Harlan's grin widened. "You think one mountain man can stop us? These girls ain't yours, Turner. Their father's nothing but a rat, and you're nothing but a fool for protecting them." Daniel stepped forward then, his voice hoarse but fierce. "You call me a rat because I caught you feeding off decent folks. You'll silence me only if you kill me. And even then the truth will out." Harlan's eyes darkened, his charm slipping. "Truth won't save you, Hale. Guns will." He signaled his men, and they fanned out slowly. Elias gave a sharp whistle, and at once the snow-packed ridge above gave way, tumbling down in a heavy sheet. The avalanche wasn't large enough to bury the men, but it sent two sprawling, their rifles lost in the drifts. Shots cracked, sharp and deafening against the mountainside. Elias fired once, hitting the snow at Harlan's feet, forcing him back. The standoff grew tense, every breath visible in the icy air. Harlan's men regrouped, their faces hard with frustration. Elias moved with deliberate calm, every step claiming the mountain as his own. His knowledge of the land was his weapon, sharper than any blade. Finally, Harlan spat into the snow, retreat flickering in his eyes. "This isn't over, Turner. You can't hide them forever. We'll be back, and when we are, no ridge will save you." Elias lowered his rifle but did not smile. He knew Harlan meant every word. When the men vanished into the trees, the cabin behind him erupted with relief. Margaret clung to Ruth. Clara's shoulders sagged though she tried to look strong, and Daniel's face carried both pride and shame. Elias stood silent, his breath heavy. The battle had been avoided, but the war was far from done. The snow settled back into silence after Harlan's retreat, but the cabin no longer felt like a place of safety. Every creak of timber, every distant echo from the trees carried the weight of coming danger. Elias sharpened his knife in the quiet, his strokes slow and deliberate, while Daniel sat near the hearth, his satchel never leaving his grip. Clara stood at the window, her arms wrapped tight across her chest. "They'll come again," she said flatly. "And next time maybe we won't be so lucky." Daniel's voice was heavy. "She's right. Harlan won't stop. The ranchers behind him won't stop. As long as I carry this proof, every man they hire will be sent to chase us down." Margaret looked at him with wide, desperate eyes. "So what do we do? Hide forever?" "No," Daniel said, his jaw tightening. "We take it to the law, to men who can't be bought. If I can get these papers into the right hands, their grip will break." Elias finally set down the knife. "That's a long road to ride, and a dangerous one. You'll be a marked man every mile." "I already am," Daniel replied. His gaze softened as he looked at his daughters. "But you won't be. That's why I can't take you with me." The words struck the room like a hammer blow. Margaret gasped, shaking her head. Ruth clutched his arm in sudden panic. "No, you just came back. You can't go again." Clara turned, her voice fierce. "You think leaving us again makes us safer? We've lived through enough nights wondering if you were alive or dead." Daniel's face twisted with pain, but he didn't falter. "Clara, if I stay, you'll never have peace. They'll come to this cabin again and again until we're buried in the snow. If I leave, I carry the storm with me. You'll have a chance here." Margaret clung to his sleeve, tears streaking her cheeks. "Please, Papa, we can help. Don't make us wait for you again." Ruth's small voice cracked through the air. "I don't want you to go." Elias stood, his expression carved from stone. "He's right about one thing. If he rides, he draws their eyes. If he stays, they'll keep circling this place until it's nothing but ashes." Clara glared at Elias. "And you agree with him? You'll just let him abandon us?" Elias met her fire without flinching. I don't agree with leaving, but I know what happens when a man's fight spills onto those he loves. Sometimes the only way to protect him is to carry the fight far away. Clara's eyes shone with unshed tears. She wanted to argue, but beneath her anger lay understanding she could not bring herself to admit. Daniel knelt, pulling all three daughters close. His voice was raw. I swear to you this isn't the end. I'll finish this fight and come back for you. But I can't promise when, and I can't promise it'll be easy. Margaret sobbed against him. Ruth buried her face in his chest, and even Clara's rigid stance faltered, her hand hovering before she finally rested it on his shoulder. Elias looked away, the sight striking a chord deep within him. He knew promises like Daniel's. He knew how easily they shattered under the weight of bullets and betrayal. And yet, seeing the girls cling to their father, he also knew that sometimes hope was the only currency left to give. When the fire dimmed, Daniel rose, shouldering the satchel. He turned to Elias, voice low. Keep them safe. I'll owe you more than life itself. Elias nodded once. They'll be safe under my roof. That much I give you. Outside, the snow whispered in the trees, as if carrying away Daniel's resolve. His horse waited, breath steaming in the cold. The sisters' cries followed him as he mounted, each word carving a mark Elias would not forget. The door closed behind them, leaving the cabin heavy with absence. The cabin was quieter after Daniel's departure, though the silence was not the same as before. It was heavy, filled with the ache of absence and the weight of words that lingered in the girls' hearts. Clara kept busy with chores, her face set in determination, though Elias noticed the way her hands sometimes trembled when she thought no one was watching. Margaret sat often by the window, gazing at the trail her father had taken, whispering prayers that he would return. Ruth carried her doll everywhere, clutching it as though holding on to the memory of her father's embrace. Elias felt the shift most of all. For years his cabin had been nothing but a shell, a place for survival, not for living. Now laughter had echoed in its walls, arguments had sharpened its air, tears had soaked into its floorboards. The sisters had changed the rhythm of his days, and though part of him longed for the simplicity of solitude, another part feared the emptiness that would come if they were gone. One evening Clara broke the silence. "You didn't have to promise him," she said suddenly, her eyes fixed on the fire. "Keeping us safe. That was his duty, not yours." Elias leaned back, arms crossed. "Duty don't end where another man leaves it. Someone's got to pick it up." Clara studied him, her sharpness softening for the first time. "Why? What do you gain?" He hesitated, then answered with quiet honesty. "I gain purpose. Been too long since I had any." The words seemed to strike something in her. She looked away, blinking quickly, and though she didn't speak again, the stiffness in her shoulders eased. In the days that followed, Elias began teaching them more. Clara learned to set traps with steady hands. Margaret practiced starting fires from sparks, and Ruth delighted in fetching kindling, proudly carrying sticks twice her size. What had begun as survival turned into something deeper, a bond forged in necessity but growing into trust. One night Margaret leaned against Elias as they sat by the fire. "You feel like family," she said softly. Ruth chimed in with a sleepy murmur. "Papa Bear." The name caught Elias off guard. He chuckled low, shaking his head, but the warmth in his chest betrayed him. For years he had shut out the world, convinced he was better off alone. Yet here, with three sisters curled close to him, he felt alive in a way the mountains alone had never given him. Still, he knew danger was not gone. Harlan's words echoed in his mind. This isn't over. The ranchers would keep hunting Daniel and, by extension, anyone tied to him. Elias had chosen his path, and it meant standing firm when that danger returned. But for now, he allowed himself the rare peace of the moment. Watching Clara's mistrust slowly melt into respect, seeing Margaret's hope brighten instead of dim, hearing Ruth's laughter ring through the cabin, it reminded him that life was more than enduring. It was protecting, guiding, and finding purpose in the lives of others. As the fire burned low, Elias spoke quietly, more to himself than to the girls. "I thought these mountains were all I needed. Turns out I was wrong." Clara glanced at him, her eyes soft for the first time. Maybe we were all wrong. Maybe we needed you too. The words settled deep, a truth Elias hadn't dared believe. The storm outside the cabin had not ended, but inside, something had been rebuilt. Trust, family, and a fragile but real sense of belonging. And so their story closed, not with finality, but with a promise carried into the uncertain dawn, that no matter the dangers to come, they would face them together. If you've walked this far through their journey, don't stop now. Subscribe for more tales that bring the Old West alive, where every choice shapes destiny. And before you go, click on the next story waiting on your screen. You won't want to miss what comes next.